in the midst of a crisis with autism, which is getting bigger and bigger all the time. And I just want to say thank you to Faces and to Susan and to all of you all for showing up for autism. Because I don't think that I would be allowed up here if it weren't a parents group that was putting this on. Because I don't specialize in working with people with disabilities. I specialize in working with people. And it was a funny situation how I started working with people with disabilities. When I was a newly minted psychotherapist almost 30 years ago, I started working for this small mental health clinic down in Cape May County. And when I got there, there was another therapist who was leaving who happened to have several people with disabilities on her caseload. And so I took over her caseload and started working with these people. And I had never learned anything about disabilities. So I just treated them the way I treated anybody else. And they started to get better. And I didn't know that they weren't supposed to get better. So so everybody noticed that they were improving, which was an unusual thing, apparently. And so I was rewarded in the way that everyone is rewarded in sort of community mental health agencies, which was that everyone with a disability then was given to me. And so I started working with people with disabilities, and I would always say, I don't have a clue how to work with people with disabilities. But as I did work with them, and many of them happily started to get better, and they started to teach me things about what it means to have a disability, people started to notice me. And so I was asked to start working with people at a local agency, group home agency. And then after a while more, I was asked to come to Woodbine, and I was lucky enough to be able to work with Dr. David London for 10 years at Woodbine, working to try to help Woodbine transition away from restrictive restraint programming. And so it's really been almost 30 years now of working with people with disabilities, slowly figuring out what I was doing. And what I used to say whenever anybody would ask me what was my secret, because I was in there working with all of these people, they assumed that I had some expertise, and they would ask me, what's the secret to working with people with disabilities? And I'd say, I have no clue, because there isn't a secret. The secret is to know that they're just like us underneath everything, and that where they are is where we would be if we had similar challenges. That the things that they're doing aren't the product of being autistic or the product of some kind of a genetic condition or being crazy. What they're doing makes sense given their view of the world and how they are processing information that's coming to them. So I'm going to be telling you 30 years worth of stuff that I've been learning. So I'm going to be saying a lot of things. I'm going to be talking fairly quickly and moving through the steps of understanding what it's like to have autism. So here is my to-do list. So the first thing I want to do is I want to describe what I think autism is and how it comes about. Then I want to discuss the physical, neurological, and psychological effects that this has on children. And then I want to talk about how to intervene in order to maximize healing. So this is a lot, okay? It's 30 years worth of stuff. As my friend Chris Devaney said, it's 8 hours worth of stuff put in 2.5 hours. So if you have questions, that's wonderful. Write them down, and I'm going to try to have some room at the end, or there's also going to be a panel discussion at the end of the day where you can ask questions, because I know everybody wants to figure out, how does this relate to my child? How does this relate to me and my situation? And that's really important, but we can't get to there until I've gotten through this whole thing, okay? So I'm going to just jump right into it. So first off is the question of what is autism? Nobody really has a clue. When I first came up with this slide, today autism affects close to 1 in 100 children. But when I first came up with it, it said 1 in 150. Now I understand that even this slide is out of date, and at least in New Jersey, it's 1 in 90, or maybe even worse than that. So this crisis of autism isn't letting up. Every year, it seems like it goes up. And what we don't understand about autism is that it's a syndrome that masquerades as a disease. And as a syndrome, that means it's a collection of behaviors and different kinds of traits that don't have a discrete cause. And because we can describe it as a syndrome, we're assuming there's a discrete cause. So one of the problems that we're having in figuring out what the cause of autism is that it's not causal in the way that we thought it was supposed to be. We thought it was supposed to be you're given a vaccination and you get autism, or you're given a bad parenting and you get autism. It isn't like that. It's something a little bit more complex. And so what the researchers have decided, we spent so much money on researching the genetic causes of autism. And I used to just rant and rave about how much money we were wasting doing that, because what they found is that there is a genetic connection to autism, but there's probably over 100 genes that have some connection to autism. And as such, it means the genetic condition is really not important. The genetic condition is there, but there isn't really very much that we can do about it. So it's a condition, it's a syndrome that's created by many different causes, either by themselves or combined with others. And the huge variation in behavior, ability, and interests seen in the population derives largely from the combination of the causes and the timing of the exposure. So what I trumpet is this idea of a cascading theory of autism. And a cascade theory is basically like bowling, that one thing hits another thing that hits another thing. And so the originating event that I believe starts the autism ball rolling is a genetic sensitivity combined with a biological insult that occurs before the age of 4, usually much earlier than that. It can even be in utero or very quickly after birth. And you'll see why that's important in a moment. And that sort of combination of things results in an autoimmune, probably, response that causes brain swelling, that causes changes in the infant's brain that result in changes in neurology and perceptual and motor function. So you have to remember that there's so much going on with the newborn when they're first on the planet. And anything that disrupts the way in which that processing is occurring changes the perceptual patterns, and then that can get locked in the brain during the course of development. But all of that isn't what we classically look at when we're looking at the behavior of autism, when we're looking at the interaction of people with autism. That comes from the third level, which is what's called inhibited ego development. And I'm going to be talking a lot about ego development because it's very important in terms of trying to help people with autism recover function, because what we're really looking at isn't curing a disease, but helping people move from one level of ego development up through the stages to higher and higher levels. So when I talk about genetic sensitivity, what I'm talking about is sensitivity. In other words, the gene doesn't lead to autism. It's not like there's an autism gene, but there's a gene, there are genetic differences that can make a person more sensitive to overwhelm. So, for example, the largest subgroup of people with autism is Down syndrome. And it's not because part of the Down gene is connected to an autism gene. It's because people with Down syndrome are more sensitive to overwhelm than people without Down syndrome. And there are many different genes that come together, either together or separately, to make a person more sensitive. And that's really the genetic connection from my point of view. What's pivotal, though, in terms of whether someone with those genes becomes autistic or not, is some kind of physical brain trauma. And, a lot of people don't like the word trauma because it's connected to psychological trauma. We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress. And there is psychological trauma in people with autism, but the main event that begins this cascade is usually something physical. And what that something is, we don't know yet. And the reason we don't know is because I think that there are many different things. So there's lots of research that shows that accidents very early on, especially when they involve the brain and cause brain swelling, can trigger autism. Seizure disorders, high fevers caused by virus or bacterial infection, toxic exposure, and extreme allergic response are other things that can cause can be the setting event for what can become autism. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody who has these things becomes autistic. What matters is how long that lasts, whether it lasts long enough for the developing brain to start forming in regard to that distortion. Because the infant's brain, when a child is born, the brain that it has over the next 3 years will triple in size and gain almost infinite more connection. So it's not like we have this static unit that's a brain that comes in and it's an autistic brain. What happens is these distortions sort of get baked in the cake as the kid ages. So when you see someone with autism, the question that I always ask is, when did this physical brain trauma event occur? Because the earlier it occurred, the more disruption there is in the functioning of that child. And also, what might have been either the event or the set of events, because very often it's not just one thing that happened. It was several different things that all seemed to come together at the same time that led to the overwhelm. So what I'm looking for is what is the overwhelm and when did it happen? Because if it was just a mild overwhelm and it happened when the child was 4, the condition that you see is going to be much different than if it was a larger overwhelm or if it happened earlier. So that's a very interesting question that we have. And sometimes we can find the answer. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we don't know what the traumatic event was. But I've seen it enough times that I'm pretty confident that this is what's going on. So that's the setting event that starts the ball rolling. The brain is distorted as a result of the brain swelling, and that leads to sensory, motor, and perceptual disorganization. And that makes sense. I mean, anybody who's had too much to drink knows what toxins can do to our perception. And if we live our lives with that form of perception, we start to see the world in different ways, and we start to do things differently. So there's a whole field of the focus on autism, and Mary is somewhere here, and she's going to be talking about some of that later on today. But this middle ground of the cascade of autism is how the brain gets shifted and then starts to get sort of baked in as those perceptual differences are locked into the neurology. But that doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way, because as children's brains grow a lot during the first 3 years. It's amazing how much new brain matter there is. But there are many different periods of phenomenal brain growth and change that occur all the way into the 20s. And then even after the 20s, there's a lot of evidence now that show about the plasticity of the brain. So it's not necessary that once it's there, it's stuck. But there are things that we can do to make this shift back to different ways, our ways of perceiving, more easy. So at the bottom of this cascade is ego development. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about ego development in just a little bit, but what are considered the hard symptoms of autism are connected to ego development. So when we're talking about qualitative impairment in social interaction, or qualitative impairments in communication, or restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior, interests, and activities, these are not caused by the original trauma. They're caused by the effect of inhibited ego development. In other words, these children are functioning at a much earlier stage in ego development where they have gotten stuck as a result of the trauma. And as long as they're stuck there, they're going to appear autistic. But it's not a disease, like I said before. It's just a condition of being stuck. And what we have to be able to do is figure out how to unstick them so they can start progressing up the scale of ego development. So when you think of who we are as human beings, it's important to realize that we're not just our psychology. You know, the guy up here who calls himself Tom is not all of who I am. The base of who I am is my biology. The base of who I am is driven by the biological processes that are going on in my body and in my mind and all around me. And these processes all affect my thinking, my perception, and even my ability to be here. So it's important to first think about ourselves as biological beings, so that if there's a problem, even if the problem maybe is repetitious behavior or is explosiveness or anxiety, that all has a biological component to it. And if you're interested in looking more into the biological components of autism, and I'm not going to be speaking that much about it today because I'm not a doctor and I could get thrown in jail for doing so, but there are some great books and wonderful people out there who are really pursuing the biological underpinnings of autism. One of which is Michael Goldberg, and he wrote a book called The Myth of Autism. And from his point of view, he says, the fact that we have this diagnosis of autism is a big part of why we can't figure out how to fix it. That because we have this diagnosis, we're throwing treatments at the diagnosis and not at the problem, which is that these kids are sick, from his point of view. So he thinks we shouldn't even call it autism, we should call it neuroimmune dysfunction syndrome. That it's an immune disorder, much like the incredible upswelling in allergies and life-threatening allergies and diabetes and all of these other things that are also going along at the same time that autism is. There's also Kenneth Bach, who's been around a long time looking at healing these kinds of things, and also the Dan doctors, Defeat Autism Now doctors. And there's websites there, and all of that is in the handouts that you have, so you shouldn't even have to write all of that down. But there isn't yet much that we know about this part of autism, because everybody has been trying to figure out what the cause is. And because of that, they're going around and they're saying, well, it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this. And that's because it's possibly a whole lot of things. So we have to be able to address it individually for each kid and figure out what was the biological event that is starting this, and then how do we deal with the neurological and then the ego development issues. So that's thinking about ourselves as our biology. Then there's the issue of thinking of ourselves as our neurology. And most of us don't do this at all. But when you think about it, neurology is where just about everything happens. In order to be in this room and to look around and see all of these people sitting here, I have to have a neurological structure that can filter out something like 90% of all of the other stimuli in order to be able to even figure out what's happening in this room. And that filtering and organizing stimuli allows us to attach meaning to it. And no two people have the same perception, but because we don't know another's perspective, we assume it to be the same as ours. So we get upset with other people because we assume that they're processing in the same way that we are, when in fact, no one is. All of us have different perceptual filtering mechanisms going on. And most of the problems that we see in autism exist either as a problem in filtering, organizing, or associating meaning. So we have to be able to figure out how to affect neurology even more than the psychology. So when we're talking about neurological components to autism, what we're looking at are trauma, phobias, triggers, which are things that happen in the environment that bring up emotional issues for us, responsiveness settings, which is people can be hyper or hyposensitive to sensory experience, to feelings like safety and protection, and even to love and belongingness. So those settings that we have that give meaning to our world are all housed in our neurology. So the effects of trauma. Early childhood trauma has been shown to produce changes in brain structure and function. And by here, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about psychological trauma. So even psychological trauma leads to changes in brain structure and function. So think what physical trauma does. And it leads to post-traumatic stress symptoms like hyper-alertness, attention problems, phobic reactions, aggressiveness, anxiety, and hopelessness. All of those symptoms are often found in people with autism. And that's because the trauma changes our neurology at the same time as it changes our perceptual filtering and coding mechanisms. So, also phobias are a part of our neurology. And phobias are inborn and they're also created. And all higher animals are susceptible to developing phobic reactions. So it's not something that's unique to people. And they occur when the brain learns to associate physical stimulus with a powerful emotional reaction. And phobias can be the result of trauma and can also be traumatic in themselves, in that a child can develop a phobia if they come into school and somebody comes over and hits them. Then all of a sudden they don't want to go to school. But also their resistance to going to school can become a trauma for them. So then these traumas can build on each other. So you keep going layer and layer back till the kid is phobic of doing almost anything. And that's sort of how phobias can build on each other as a result of the underlying trauma. And then triggers. Children and people with poor ego development experience triggers as causing their feelings rather than triggering a feeling. Most of us, when we have a bad feeling, we can sit with that feeling and say, you know what? I don't feel so good about this. I wonder what I want to do. For children, they can't do that. They experience everything as coming in at them because of their levels of ego development, which we'll talk about more. And so, from their point of view, they can't separate the trigger from the emotional reaction. So when you ask a kid, well, why did you blow up like that? They'll say, because somebody looked at me wrong, or because somebody was mean to me, or because there was this thing happening. They don't get that there's a separation between their internal experience and the external trigger. So one of the things that we have to be able to do to help them is to help them relearn these triggering events. So this confusion leads to a desire to eliminate the trigger rather than reduce their own anxiety or anger. So the kids will want to, if Johnny did something and I feel bad, I want Johnny gone. I want Johnny out of the way. Or I want to attack Johnny because that's the problem, not my own internal experience. So we have to figure out how to separate that for these kids. And then there's also the effects of responsiveness settings. And that's pretty clear, and Mary's going to be talking about that more this afternoon, so I'm not even going to talk about that too much. But it's just a matter of that all of the ways in which we organize events and time and sequencing are all part of our neurology and don't exist at lower levels of ego development. So children at very low levels of ego development, time is meaningless. Time doesn't exist as a way of being able to organize events, and so they're anxious all the time. Same with a lot of different things. So, again, if you want more information about the neurological resources, sensory integration dysfunction was first studied in depth by Anna Jean Ayers, and I think that was in the late 60s. So it's been around a long time. There's a lot of evidence, I think, that supports it. And so here is the information. I even have Mary Kintz's email address, which she might hate me for later, but there it is. So how do we come to be? So we've been talking sort of about the disruption, but then how do we come to be as normal human beings? We're all born with states and traits that are apparent from birth. Any of you who've had children will be holding your baby and saying, oh, isn't he a sweet little baby? Or he's a fussy baby, or he's a calm baby, or he's a picky eater. that these states and traits are what the children come in with. They don't come in with personalities, but they come in with states and traits that are related to their biology and their neurology. And those states and traits interact with the environment, and some of them get bigger and some of them get smaller. So if your little baby is calm and cooing and you're there and you're playing with them, that's going to get bigger. If the little baby is screaming and you're playing with them, that might get bigger. So these states and traits interact with the environment, and then they either get bigger or they get smaller. And so that's sort of the basis of behaviorism, but it's really the basis of how we are as human beings, that we have these basic states, and it's how these states are interacted with, and not just by people in our environment, but by substances we eat. If we have an allergy and it causes our gut to contract, the baby's going to be more fussy, and then that fussiness is going to get interacted in a different way. So all of these physical and neurological and psychological issues are going on at the same time. And all of these things lead to what's called constrained ego development. And I've already mentioned that before. So what is ego development? Ego development is our window on the world. It's how do we see what is going on. And like I said before, none of us see things the same way. It's always different. And before there is any self, there's awareness. So if you think about a newborn baby getting born into the world, and he doesn't even know how to move his hands, he doesn't even know how to focus his eyes yet. But there is awareness there without intention and without attention. That initial experience of open awareness without perceptual filters is the first stage of ego development. And I'm going to be talking about that in a second, but for those of you who want to know more about ego development, there's the slide on the various people who looked into ego development. Ego development concepts have been around for eons. Most of you who've taken intro psych classes have learned various forms of ego development. The one that I'm going to be talking to you about is kind of my own conceptualization of these people's conceptualization. But this last person on the list, Donna Williams, is, she was supposed to speak at the FACES conference last year, but she wasn't able to make it here. She is an amazing autistic savant, and she's able to type things that she's not able to say. But the books that she has written are phenomenal textbooks on what it's like to be inside the mind of an autistic person. And this book that she wrote, Autism and Sensing, The Unlost Instinct, it's a very thin little book, and it describes each of these levels of ego development, even though she doesn't call it that, as she evolved over time from an infant on, so that you can see the inner experience of what it is to be autistic. And this is the basic conception of the spectrum of consciousness. How's that for a nice word? So basically what happens is children come in and there's no self. There's awareness, but there's no intention, there's no attention. Gradually that shifts, and all of a sudden a self forms. But it forms in the absence of there being any other selves, which makes sense. First thing you got to have is your own self. So there's a self, but there's nobody else. And then after a while, the child develops a little bit more, and then there's the concept of self and other. Ooh, I exist, and there's somebody else that exists. So there's interaction becomes possible. And then you go further and further up the developmental ladder. And just so you know, none of us are at the top of this developmental ladder. I say that fairly confidently. There's always a level beyond which you're at. And when you're experiencing anxiety, it's because of lots of anxiety, and it's usually because you're getting ready to move to the next level. Because none of us evolve in ego development terms from our current level to the next level without a certain amount of anxiety, without having to. Because each level up, the reason it's a continuum isn't because it's better, that these higher levels are better than the lower levels, but they're more complex. And they take into account more interaction, more things, so there's more power in the higher levels than there is in the lower levels. So what I'm going to show you next is a video that I stole off YouTube. And this is of a young woman named Amanda Baggs, and she demonstrates what I consider to be the first stage of ego development.
The previous part of this video was in my native language. Many people have assumed that when I talk about this being my language, that means that each part of the video must have a particular symbolic message within it, designed for the human mind to interpret. But my language is not about designing words or even visual symbols for people to interpret. It is about being in a constant conversation with every aspect of my environment, reacting physically to all parts of my surroundings. In this part of the video, the water doesn't symbolize anything. I am just interacting with the water as the water interacts with me. Far from being purposeless, the way that I move is an ongoing response to what is around me. Ironically, the way that I move when responding to everything around me is described as being in a world of my own, whereas if I interact with a much more limited set of responses and only react to a much more limited part of my surroundings, people claim that I am opening up to true interaction with the world. They judge my existence, awareness, and personhood on which of a tiny and limited part of the world I appear to be reacting to. The way I naturally think and respond to things looks and feels so different from standard concepts or even visualization that some people do not consider it thought at all, but it is a way of thinking in its own right. However, the thinking of people like me is only taken seriously if we learn your language, no matter how we previously thought or interacted. As you heard, I can sing along to what is around me. It is only when I type something in your language that you refer to me as having communication. I smell things. I listen to things. I feel things. I taste things. I look at things. It is not enough to look and listen and taste and smell and feel. I have to do those to the right things, such as look at books, and fail to do them to the wrong things, or else people doubt that I am a thinking being. And since their definition of thought defines their definition of personhood so ridiculously much, they doubt that I am a real person as well. I would like to honestly know how many people, if you met me on the street, would believe I wrote this. I find it very interesting by the way that failure to learn your language is seen as a deficit, but failure to learn my language is seen as so natural that people like me are officially described as mysterious and puzzling rather than anyone admitting that it is themselves who are confused, not autistic people or other cognitively disabled people who are inherently confusing. We are even viewed as non-communicative if we don't speak the standard language, but other people are not considered non-communicative if they are so oblivious to our own languages as to believe they don't exist. In the end, I want you to know that this has not been intended as a voyeuristic freak show where you get to look at the bizarre workings of the autistic mind. It is meant as a strong statement on the existence and value of many different kinds of thinking and interaction in a world where how close you can appear to a specific one of them determines whether you are seen as a real person, or an adult, or an intelligent person, and in a world in which those determine whether you have any rights. There are people being tortured, people dying, because they are considered non-persons, because their kind of thought is so unusual as to not be considered thought at all. Only when the many shapes of personhood are recognized will justice and human rights be possible.
what she just described for you isn't the experience of everyone with autism. What she was describing is what I consider the first stage of ego development, something that all of us go through, but most of us evolve through it early. Some people get stuck there, usually because of trauma. So the first stage, in the first stage, there's no figure and no ground. There's no perceiver, there's no attention, and there's no intention. Only sensing and resonance. So as she's saying that her communication doesn't involve symbolic meaning. There's no expression going on because there's no one to express to. There's no one to express. There's no self when a person is in that level of development. It is a blissful state of being. But it's dysfunctional because it leaves the person severely autistic with no ability to act on the world. So it's not a bad state in itself. In fact, it is what most gurus and highly spiritual people are trying to evolve to. It's that experience of connection to the infinite, but without there being an ego, without there being a structure that also understands and communicates with these other levels of perception, the person is cut off from the rest of us. So it's not a bad place to be, but it's not a functional place to stay. And we don't see a lot of people, or at least I don't see a lot of people now who are stuck in this first stage. When I first started working at Woodbine, there were a bunch of men who were there who were stuck in this first stage. And they were people who you would go into their living place, and they'd be sitting there rocking and going like this. And they loved it. They were happy until something happened, until they got hungry, or until somebody came over and bopped them on the head, or until some physiological experience called them out of that awareness into the next stage, which is all self. So for these people, they would become hungry, or it was time to go eat something, and they would all of a sudden come out of this autistic experience. They'd wake up, and it's like they were suddenly beamed onto the planet. All of a sudden, they come from nothing to there's people around, there's pain or discomfort or hunger, there's something that they need, they don't know what to do, and so then they would become anxious. And when they would become anxious, then they would start to behave in certain ways. And because they didn't know really what they were doing, it was considered a big problem for the staff who were trying to help these people, because they would move into uncontrolled behavior because they would all of a sudden wake up to the fact that something was wrong and they needed to be fixed. So they would wake up from stage 1 and move into stage 2. Stage 2 is the first person experience. And this is where typically people that I see now with autism seem to be stuck. And in the stage 2, it's all first person experience. There's me, and I'm the only one that really exists. Others have form and function, but the form and function of others is more like the form and function of things, of chairs and tables. They have a purpose, they're useful or they're not useful, but they don't exist in the same way that I exist when I'm in second stage. So all experience is what's called self-referential. Everything has to do with me. Very egocentric because it's all there is. Not because they're selfish, but because they haven't yet learned that there's states beyond self. All perception is external, object-oriented, and need-driven. It's a lonely, angry, anxious stage. attention and intention arise here and are directed toward meeting perceived needs. Depth in this stage is marked by the gradual learning of rules of behavior applied to self and other, which are gradually developed in order to assuage an angry, unpredictable world. Okay? So, what you see is children who have to be helped with sequences because time doesn't exist at this stage. What you see are children that have to be helped with interactive patterns, with learning what to do with others, because others don't really exist at this stage. So they have to learn it as a series of rules that can be applied rather than understand it intuitively because they haven't yet made the leap of being able to see that others exist.
Is this van going anywhere today, or is it staying here? Is it going to go on a ride? Can I drive this one? Vroom, vroom, vroom. I'll follow your van. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Beep, beep. This one doesn't have any doors, does it? Yours has the doors. Mine has lots of people. Can we go for a ride together? Come here, Gary. Drive on the rug. Here, look over here. Can you follow? A ball. That's a big ball. Big squeak.
Now, Mommy, what are your major goals with him now? What are you trying to work on?
Keeping him on the rug. Entertained on the rug.
So this is someone who's in stage 2. He's all in self. You'll see that there's really not much attention given to the caregiver or to the other people. And the language is not terribly important to him. And when people are in stage 1 and in stage 2, they generally don't have much language. Language doesn't start to form until the end of stage 2 because they don't understand the reason for language. And it isn't because they're not capable of language or because they have necessarily because they have speech defects. So very often they do as a result of the underlying neurological issues. But the main issue isn't the neurological one, isn't the ability to create speech. The main issue is the ability to understand what the purpose of speech is. And that's why speech tends to be first telegraphic. And you'll often see as children at this stage start to learn speech that they get frustrated because they just assume that you know what they want. And the reason that they're assuming that is because they don't yet get that you're different than them. That you're an organism separate and equal to them. And so that's an evolutionary step that is still outside of their grasp. So they're just having to learn everything by rules. And so we have to be able to give them structure. And we'll be talking about that later. So the goal for most parents who have an autistic child is to help them get to stage 3. And I often say to parents, be careful what you wish for, because once you get them there, you get a whole nother level of issue. That stage 3 is the adoption of second-person awareness, the recognition that other people exist. And it's not something that happens. Well, I'll just read this quickly. No. So stage 3 is the adoption of second-person awareness, which in most people quickly develops into a simultaneous self and other awareness. Depth in this stage is marked by the gradual adoption of persons with whom it can be held. People become real to the child, which marks a shift in their relating. Emotions, self-comparison, and genuine compassion mark this stage. Depth is also marked by the gradual shift from external, mommy's favorite color is blue, to the internal, mommy's feeling sad now. So, children who are at stage 2, when mommy gets angry, the child will look at them and laugh because mommy's face is funny. When the child starts to move into stage 3 is when they'll start to figure out mommy's unhappy. And the transition into stage 3 doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly over time. So generally, one person will be the first person to pop into existence. So very often it's the mother, which has good and bad things for the poor mother. But as the person pops into existence for the child, it's like all of a sudden the child is all by themselves and you got beamed on the planet. And so all of a sudden the child wants to attach to you and wants you for everything and cares about you, but is also angry at you for everything because it's your responsibility to make the world work for them. Okay? So very often parents spend a lot of time trying to get their child to stage 3. They start to pop into stage 3 and then parents panic because it's like, oh my God, it was so much simpler than before. And it's just a different stage that the child is moving in. And we want to be able to keep them moving. So we want more and more people to be able to pop into existence. And at this stage, it's important for the child to start deepening their understanding of other. So at first, when they get that mom exists, mom doesn't exist as a fully formed figure. Mom exists in that mom is there to take care of me. Mom has reality, but not a deep reality. The child doesn't necessarily understand that if I get mad and hit mom, that it's going to hurt mom. Instead, they just get that mom is being mean because she's not giving me what I want. So there's a depth that has to occur in this stage in which more people need to become real for them, and they have to start understanding that other people have internal experience in the same way that these children have internal experience. And at the same time that they're learning it about other people, they're learning about themselves because their own understanding of who they are is shallow and always getting deeper. So as you're looking at this developmental levels, you see that it goes up and down, but it also has depth. And the depth is the amount of complexity and understanding that occurs at that level. So here's someone. So, and stage 3 is what is generally considered ADHD.
See you. There's 2 of you. A poke. Shiny Rusty. Shiny. Where's it? Which one is it? Yeah. Right there.
So this is someone who's in stage 3. All of what you just saw was interactive. It was all about, look at me, interact with me, calling my attention to me. When you saw the child who was in stage 2, he didn't care about your attention. It wasn't even important to him because he hadn't figured out that other people are important and really exist. This kid gets it. But you can also see, if you look at his eyes, he's got these big red circles around his eyes. That's usually a good example of allergies. So just so that you're thinking that there's these ego development stages, there's also the biological and neurological that's underpinning all of this. So this kid probably has some serious food allergies that are untreated that if he were to fix that, would probably be able to move through the stages faster. But at any rate, this is what stage 3 looks like. And so be careful what you wish for as you move your child from autism up to stage 2, up to stage 3. what you start to see is sort of attention deficit issues, a lot of impulsivity, a lot of sort of targeting of other children, a lot of sometimes sadness that they don't have the friendships that they wish that they could have, but they don't yet have the complexity of behavior in order to be able to maintain friendship. So what we're then looking for is to move the child into stage 4, which is the self-aware stage. And this is the typical school-age child. Stage 4 is the adoption of third-person awareness. And here the child becomes able to observe his own behavior and comment on and manage himself dynamically. This is the stage of the typical elementary school child. So this is the child who can think, I want to get up and get a drink of water, but the teacher wouldn't like it, so I think I'm going to stay here. Now, that's a level of complexity that the earlier stages don't have. So very often we get irritated with autistic children because they don't think that way, but they don't think that way because they can't yet. Okay? So in order to be able to really think that way, you have to be able to get to stage 4. And once a child gets to stage 4, they're generally off and running. And we'll just talk about stage 5. I'm not going to go beyond stage 5 because stage 5, or the rational stage, is really the target of our society. It's kind of where we're trying to get to as human beings, and it's where the typical high school student is. So stage 5 begins with the ability to embed the third-person experience in time. Time here shifts from an experience and an external phenomenon to an internal one, making the person more goal-directed and expanding awareness to societies or large groups. All things that can be perceived at this level are considered separate, reducible, and objectified. This is the goal of our society and is the highest conventional stage. So in other words, people who are at this level are able to organize their behavior, are able to plan, are able to build companies, are able to do scientific experiments. They're able to look at a problem, figure out a solution, and implement that solution. And that's because they're able to take this part of themselves that is able to look at themselves and their own behavior, and they're able to embed it in time so that they can plan. Until you get to that stage, you really can't do sort of scientific experiments or create complex structures because you're not operating at the right level of leadership. So as you can see, that rational stage is only about somewhere in the middle. There's other stages like systems conscious, construct aware, and unitive, which you can learn more about from any of those references that I gave you in the beginning, but that we don't really have time to go into today. So what you can see is that there's an arising experience. It's almost like there's this window out on the world that begins with no self. It's just like Amanda Baggs, that young woman who's, doing these things. That is a wonderful, free, safe place that children want to stay. But once they get called out of that, then they often learn behaviors to try to get back there. And that's where you see a lot of the self-stimming behavior is a way to be able to climb back there. Because these developmental stages don't just go up, you can come down them too. So the things that cause people to go from a higher stage to a lower stage are, in a word, stress. Anytime any of us is under stress, we'll go from our current level of functioning and drop down a level or two and work at a more primitive level of functioning, which typically doesn't work as well, but it's because stress causes us to either lose a stage and either go. And so we have to remember that all of this is relationship, that ego development itself is all about that space that exists between self and other. And developing that, over time, a broader and broader understanding of self and a broader and broader understanding of other, as well as that space that exists between them. So, what I've given you so far, I'm even on time here. What I've given you so far is an understanding of how I see autism. In other words, it's a cascade of issues that are caused by genetic sensitivity and some kind of a stressor that happens before the age of 4 that leads to neurological problems, that then leads to ego development problems. And so when someone is coming in to see me, my question is, what's going on with them on all 3 levels? And you can't just treat one level. If you find out that the child had some kind of an infection, and that infection is cured, that doesn't necessarily change the neurological differences, because those have already sort of been baked in, and it doesn't necessarily change the developmental stuckness, because what's required is for development is that the child not be overwhelmed all the time. These people with autism spend much of their time right at the brink of being overwhelmed. And the reason for that is partly because of complexity. They're trying to understand this complex world that we can grasp intuitively, and they're trying to grasp it all through these rules. But also, they're dealing with the fact that their neurology is not the same as ours, so they have all these sensory differences that they have to figure out how to deal with. And their biology is different than ours, so they might be dealing with an allergy or dealing with pain or discomfort that they don't even know how to deal with. So they're always on the brink of overwhelm.